It's Hugh here. We're going over some basics of bioenergetics, and I think this is the core of what you need to know for the metabolism unit. Um, this is the way I understand it anyway. So we're looking at both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and the cellular respiration we're focusing on is aerobic, which means oxygen is needed, and that's why oxygen's there. Glucose stands as a stand-in for all the food molecules, so food plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide and water. And we just want to see how do we, this purpose of this process is to extract energy in the form of ATP, 36 to 38 of them per one glucose. And let's just see how it works. First is to understand where the energy is in the molecule. Energy is stored in electrons, and remember each dash represents two dots, two electrons. And just by the inherent nature of the bond, a CH bond has high energy electrons and CC bonds have high energy electrons. Those electrons have more energy than the electrons found in a CO bond and an OH bond. That's why I've colored these ones blue for low energy, these ones red for hot or high energy. Okay. You'll notice that CO2 has just got CO bonds, so it's very low in energy. H2O has two OH bonds, very low in energy. There's very little energy in these molecules. However, glucose, and I've tried to draw it here, it's not accurate, but it's the right idea. There's high energy bonds all over the place. There. All these ones, either CH bonds or C bonds, they all have lots of energy. And the process of metabolism and respiration is to pull the energy out of this molecule and deliver it in a form the cell can use as ATP. So this is how it works. Basically, first of all, coming in, here's the food. We need a molecule that will come in to take those hot electrons out, and as you know, it's our NAD+. NAD+ is that empty dump truck. I'm just going to illustrate with the CH bond. It'll come in, grab those two hot electrons. It also has to grab an H+ that's just floating around, and there's always H+ floating around in the mitochondria. And the combination of the two negatives, and of course remember the electrons are negatively charged, two negatives, two positives, produces the molecule NADH. And it's a carrier for those two hot electrons. So those electrons are taken away from the food by the molecule NADH. So I call this an electron dump truck. This is full. This one's empty. The process by which electrons join a molecule is called reduction. So gaining electrons is reduction, so NAD+ gains two electrons, so this is reduction. However, a reduction cannot occur without an oxidation. The food loses the electrons and the food is oxidized. The NAD pulling hot electrons from the food primarily happens in the Krebs cycle, but also in glycolysis and pyruvate oxidation for sure. NAD has not been turned into ATP yet, so to do that, it goes to the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Remember, it's phospholipid layer and a bunch of proteins. These proteins that sit together in the inner membrane are collectively called the electron transport chain. The NAD arrives at the first one. It happens to be called, it's an enzyme called NADH reductase because can't remember. NADH dehydrogenase because it dehydrogenates the NAD. In any event, what happens is the electrons jump to the first of the proteins. Electron transport chain. Once the electrons have left NAD, it becomes NAD+, and it's back to pick up more hot electrons. The H just floats off, and it's going to be important later on. So the life of an NAD is pretty simple. Pick up electrons from food, dump them to the electron transport chain, and come back and get more. Words that we use here. NAD plus is reduced to form NADH. NADH is oxidized when it loses those electrons to form NAD plus. This first cytochrome protein, when it gains electrons, it's reduced. But then the electrons hop along from one to the next protein. Each one has a stronger pull for the electrons. But as they are being pulled along, they are running what are called proton pumps. So the protons, the energy of the molecule, the electrons are being used up, and by the time they get down to the end, they're low energy electrons. Their energy has been transferred into the pumping of 3 H plus ions, and it pumps out of the matrix and into the intermembrane space. Three times. Those are pumps, so this is known as an active transport mechanism. Energy has been used to pump hydrogen ions from low concentration to higher concentrations. Now the electrons have very little energy. They need to be disposed of. If they're not disposed of, these pair will not be able to make the jump, and the entire chain stops working. So the role of oxygen here, necessary, it comes in fact, half of an oxygen, 1/2 O2, one oxygen atom plus those 2 electrons along with 2 H pluses produces water. And remember, those have the low energy electrons going there. So the flow of electrons goes from food, where there's a lot of high energy electrons, through the electron carrier, along the electron transport chain, and finally ends up in water. There's also another electron carrier. If you want the details, of course, FADH2, FAD, it's just another dump truck. It does not quite have as much energy as the NADH. And because there's 3 protons pumped here, then when they return through ATP synthase, they produce 3 ATPs. Okay, now photosynthesis, commonly thought of as the green process, because chloroplasts are green, and that's because chlorophyll is green, begins with a light-dependent reaction. Light is where the energy comes from. Same idea. The inputting molecule is water and CO2, both with very low energy electrons. The energy from light is combined with those to produce the high energy glucose and the waste product of oxygen. Basically, it's the same kind of idea as electron transport chain. It's on the thylakoid membrane, and it's a series of proteins, each one which shuttles electrons along. The difference is here is that the electrons start out as very cold or low energy electrons, and each time they're shuttled, they gain a little bit of energy until they're hot or high energy. This happens because light hits this chain at a couple of processes. So these are photons of light, and they provide the energy that takes the electrons and gradually produces the ones which have high energy. The high energy electrons are picked up in the same way by an electron dump truck. The one that plant cells have evolved to use is pretty much the same as the animal ones, except it's got an extra phosphate. So it's NADPH, or just the empty dump truck is NADP+. Nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. It's got 1 fewer electron. Each electron, remember, is negative. So when it picks up 2 electrons, it's being reduced. It's gaining electrons. It needs to pick up a proton, but there's always ones floating around. H plus ion, 2 pluses, 2 minuses, and we have NADPH. And that's carrying the 2 powerful electrons. One trouble we have here is that once the electrons have shuttled along the chain, this first protein is deficient. It's missing 2 electrons. It cannot keep supplying electrons no matter how much light is there. So we need to replenish these. This is where water comes in. Water, having those low energy electrons, has them pulled off of it. When that happens, what's left over is oxygen and some H pluses. So an oxygen, half of an O2, plus two H pluses come out, and this process is the oxidation of water. It's losing electrons. Electrons are leaving water and going to the first protein, and then they get shuttled and energized. There's a flow of electrons in photosynthesis, just as there is in the mitochondria. The thylakoid membrane is the equivalent in the chloroplast of the inner mitochondrial membrane. They're very, very similar. They have very similar structures. This is the light-dependent process. The light-independent process is the Calvin cycle, and it uses the power of the NADPH as well. It's more complicated than I'm showing you here, but that's why it's a project. The ATP is also produced here, and those go off to the Calvin cycle to produce the glucose sugar. Of course, what comes back from the Calvin cycle is the empty dump truck, and of course, ADP. And it gets charged up here. So, summarizing, energetics of life is about electron flow. From low energy to high energy in photosynthesis, and from high energy to low energy in respiration. Both processes almost identical, but doing the opposite thing.